What is up, you awesome kisters? This is CistReactZ here, guys. Today we're reacting to I Solved Scott Cawthon's FNAF Retcon 8 years later. So make sure you guys hit that like button, subscribe to Hyperdroid, and comment down below. Let's get right into it, Bob. I feel like there's been...
The lore in the first few FNAF games...
I feel like there's been a lot of retcon videos, like, lately hitting my recommended page.
Was created
I'm wondering
as
why.
Scott Cawthon went along, meaning some ideas were later expanded upon or clarified in the following game or even following book. But before the release of FNAF 6, he actually revealed that one thing was retconned within the story that we didn't notice. So what was it? Today I'll present the multiple possibilities of what this retcon could be, such as the infamous dream theory, before we settle on the answer with a piece of evidence that we
talking
all
about something
missed, that possibly
back in the
solidifies
day.
this as confirmed by Scott himself. So subscribe so we can hit 275,000 subscribers before the end of the month. Like the video,
I believe in
and let's
Hyperdroid.
finally solve the FNAF retcon 8 years later. Quick disclaimer, while I personally think this might actually be confirmed, I'd still like to preface that this is just my opinion and is still just a theory.
Oh, he gave me straight PTSD. I thought an ad was about to play on the video or something.
No matter what. I have no actual
gave me
say
straight
what's true or not,
PTSD.
even if I'm 99.9% certain in this. So without further ado, let's get into this theory. To put us all on the same page, back on the 4th of September 2017, user Gravity Silence posed a question in the FNAF Reddit. Do you think that Scott has had the entire lore planned out since FNAF 1, or is he just making it up as he goes along? To which Scott himself
Honestly,
actually
probably
replied
the second
with a joke,
one.
stating all planned all along from the beginning of time.
He
Never
lying.
had to retcon anything. Which very quickly started a fire in the Reddit. And so the very next day, Scott made a full post titled The Retcon Issue. Within the
Retcon
post, he states,
Issue.
The truth is that I've done one actual retcon in the series, although I'm not going to say where it was. Later editing the post to include, to be fair, the one retcon mentioned was integrated pretty seamlessly, and most people didn't notice. If it had caused problems or confusion, then I would have addressed it here. So what was FNAF's one retcon? Well, with that information...
So it's something that could be added seamlessly, and it's so small that not everybody would like need to know or be confused by it. Huh.
In mind, we can actually make a simple theory killer checklist for whether something could be the retcon or not. 1. It has to occur before Pizzeria Simulator FNAF 6 was released, at the end of 2017, as the retcon post obviously predates the game. 2. It has to be a noticeable retcon in the story, aka evidently changed. And 3. Although it wasn't a confusion point in the community, nor affected any theories to the point that it wasn't even noticed, aka wasn't something major. And honestly, the fact that this mystery has persisted to this day does actually prove that it was seamless. So let's begin diving deep into each theory about what this retcon could be and see which ones survive the checklist, as well as giving alternative explanations for them if they're not the retcon, which actually helps clean up some lore, so stick around to the end. The biggest theory that we've all seen about it that I must discuss is Dream Theory.
Lock in everybody.
Dream Theory, created by
Dream
Matt
Theory
Pat from
retcon.
Game Theory, was born from FNAF 4 and theorized that everything in FNAF was simply a dream by the crying child in a coma after the bite of 83. A lot of people believe this to be true, and some still do think that this was the original intention. So let's head over to the checklist. This would have been changed in the very next game, System Location, aka FNAF 5.
All a
so
dream?
Box 1, check. It's of course a majorly noticeable change in the story, so Box 2, check. Although that's actually the issue when it comes to Box 3. It's way too big of a change that redirects the entire direction of the lore from the bite forward, meaning we cannot check Box 3, and therefore this option is eliminated. While it may have been believable at the time, with all due respect to Matt Pat of course, the theory simply turned out to be incorrect.
That's like one of many PNGs that give off aura. Like this is just like trying to go back as much as I can. Try to go back. Like I don't think anybody has ever made like so much aura in an old PNG of themselves, but Matt Pat has.
The theory simply turned out to be incorrect. The biggest point proving that, which I think a lot of people forgot, is actually the fact that Matt Pat himself debunked the theory and went against it a single week later, telling us the many problems with it, and then even detailing a timeline of events to include FNAF 4 alongside the other games.
I didn't even know that.
Not only this, but Scott even replied to a post soon after about how Dream Theory should jokingly die, stating, "I know, right? Who came came up with this anyway, which was the start of
Dang.
his many jokes about the theory ever since, even as recently as the movie featuring a book titled Dream Theory.
I would low-key be mad if the purple guy didn't exist.
Chica would be missing her beak. Well, MatPat wasn't actually that far
I'd
off
be
way
mad.
back then, as to what some, including me, currently theorize it to mean, that it was a hint that the toy animatronics were actually based on these old toys, with this tiny toy Chica having a detachable beak inspiring them to give the new Chica a detachable beak too, explaining why they're all called the toy animatronics, despite only ever being called the new animatronics in universe, with Phone Guy even calling Pre-Mangle literally just Foxy. Similar to the other two hints, these weren't meant to be anything massive that solved the entire lore in one foul swoop. The hint about the misunderstanding? Simply about the crying child seeing Afton put an employee in a suit. The hint about all 4 games being one story? Simply to guide us away from thinking one game didn't happen or one game didn't matter. So while I do understand why some believe Dream Theory to be the retcon, it simply can't be because it was debunked soon after and changes quite literally everything we knew about the story. Not so seamless. So now we've eliminated Dream Theory, let's move on to the next biggest theory about the retcon that also comes from FNAF 4, suggesting that the contents in the FNAF 4 box was retconned. This isn't even a baseless accusation, as Scott himself has gone on record to state that the contents of the box have changed multiple times, even recently stating that what was inside basically doesn't even matter anymore.
Like, how does it change?
Heading over to the checklist, and this one actually breaks all 3 rules. Think about it, the box was never actually open to us. We never saw what the true contents of the box were, and until Scott directly told us they were changed in the Dorko interview after Ultimate Custom Night released in 2018, we couldn't have ever known that to be true. No matter if it was changed once, twice, or even a billion times, we wouldn't have ever known it was changed a single time if it weren't for that interview. Scott's statement about the box comes 2 whole games after the retcon post itself, and therefore makes it an unnoticeable change. And not only that, but it's undeniably one of FNAF's biggest mysteries to this day, and one of the biggest confusion points that Scott has talked about multiple times.
It's the pieces
all
put
3
together
rules are actually broken. Continuing on, and we have the theory that the gender of the puppet's spirit was retconned. This comes from the fact that back in FNAF 2 we get a secret minigame showing us the murder of the child that goes on to possess the puppet, as shown by its jump scare straight after. Although during this minigame we audibly hear the letters spelt out, S-A-V-E-H-I-M, save him. Later in the story though, we then get more information on the same event, and the child within
should have been save her,
where we learn that the child is actually a girl named Charlie, the daughter of Henry. This is a change, but heading to the checklist, this immediately breaks the first rule. We didn't know that the puppet's possessor was now a girl at all at the time, since the retcon post predates FNAF 6's release. While Charlie did exist in the novel trilogy, there was absolutely nothing connecting her character to the death of the puppet's possessor at the time, mainly due to that very fact that it was Save Him, which would have debunked that theory at the time, making this change unnoticeable at the time too. Finally, it's also not seamless. We all immediately picked up on the fact that it was changed in FNAF 6. So what is it if it's not the retcon? Well, while it could just be a second retcon, like fellow FNAF theorist ID's Fantasy suggests, the he could actually be referring to the puppet animatronic itself, since not only are we playing this minigame after the child is already dead, therefore we literally cannot save the child, but later games like Ultimate Custom Night continue to use he for the puppet, despite us knowing that it's possessed by Charlie by that point. So this theory also doesn't survive the checklist and is eliminated. Similar to that theory after the child is already dead, therefore we literally cannot save the child, but later games like Ultimate Custom Night continue to use he for the puppet.
I didn't even know that. Or maybe I did realize it, or like maybe read it on a video, but like just didn't even notice that I was reading he and him.
Despite us knowing that it's possessed by Charlie by that point. So this theory also doesn't survive the checklist and is eliminated. Similar to that theory, there is another one coming from good old MatPat, stating that the crying child possessing the puppet was retconned. This theory comes from that very same save him statement that we just discussed, connecting the 2 children due to their constantly crying nature, and his striped shirt matching the puppet's striped arms. Although mid-development on FNAF 4, Scott changed it to make it so the crying child was a separate new character, with nothing to do with the other kid. While I can see where he's coming from, and it isn't even a bad theory about the original intention of the crying child, and it might actually hold true, when we actually head to the checklist, it does succeed rule 1, but then unfortunately fails rules 2 and 3. This change would have been made during development, and so before the game even released to us. Therefore, we couldn't have possibly noticed that it was retconned at all. Only Scott would know. Not only that, but if it were true, it would be quite a big change, splitting one of the most important characters in the plot into two entirely different characters. So while I can't even debunk that it may have actually been Scott's intention while creating FNAF 4, I can safely say that it isn't the retcon itself, and is eliminated from the list of possibilities. The next possibility is that the original owner of Fredbear's Family Diner was retconned. If you're confused, in FNAF 2, as you know, we get calls from the phone guy, which within one of these calls, he states,
we're going to try to contact the original restaurant owner. I think the name of the place was Fredbear's Family Diner or something like that.
Which implies that there's only one owner of Fredbear's Family Diner, despite us later knowing that Henry was actually the co-owner of the location in the first FNAF book, The Silver Eyes. Head into the checklist, and on the surface it seems to actually pass the first two. Although not only is the third rule broken, as it changes the entire backstory of the restaurant and company, but when you realize that we didn't actually know if Henry was even in the game lore or not by the time the retcon post was made, it ends up breaking rule 1 and 2 as well. We didn't know Henry carried over into the game timeline until FNAF 6 released with the audio log HRY223, commonly believed to stand for Henry 2023. But wait, we do know that this was changed though, so how isn't it a second retcon? Well, the first and most likely reason is actually due to the fact that the phone guy says it. Right before he says that line, we can hear that he's stumbling over his words with stress about the incident, and literally almost forgets the name of the location itself, questioning whether it was even right. So it can very easily be written off as phone guy simply making a mistake. Not only that, but right after that statement, he says,
"They're closed for years though, I doubt we'll be able to track anybody down."
Which anybody does inherently imply multiple people. Although if you're not satisfied with this answer, another way to make sense of this quote is that within that same call we hear that the phone guy has learned about what's going on, and even mentions the concerns about previous employees. So it's highly likely that they figured out that the previous employee in the location was actually William Afton under the disguise. And so the original owner they're trying to track down is actually Henry after all. Theories aside, and no matter what the alternative explanation for that line is, it cannot be the retcon that Scott was talking about, since it breaks all three rules. Speaking of the phone guy, and the next contender is that the animatronics existing for 20 years was retconned. Again, if you're confused, even earlier in FNAF 1, phone guy says this interesting line.
I just realized Hyperjoy kind of just made me like solo in and lock in, and I haven't commentated in a while. I'm sorry about that, but he's just kind of... Hyperjoy's just kind of cooking right now.
If I were forced to sing...
I'm sorry if the commentary is what y'all like.
Stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too.
Which wouldn't make too much sense when considering that by that time the retcon post was made, the earliest date in the timeline that we knew of was 1983. This does seem to fit our checklist at first glance, although there's actually a few problems with this being the retcon. The biggest problem comes from listening to the full quote, specifically the delivery of it.
The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night, but do I blame them? No. If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too.
While people focus on...
It's kind of crazy when Scott made those like first few lines for the night one phone call. Bro just probably never knew he would like end up making like a 5-star movie on it. It's crazy.
In the 20 years detail specifically, the entire context around that quote and the cadence of his voice delivery heavily implies that it's meant to be a joke, and simply over-exaggerating for the sake of over-exaggerating, really just meaning that they haven't been cleaned for a while. The animatronics don't actually get suits, don't actually get given baths. I always took this as a joke. Just like the previous theory, it comes down to the phone guy actually meaning every single thing that he says, and everything being undoubtedly truthful with no room for error, which doesn't really work with a character as stumbly and as jokeful as the phone guy, who makes multiple jokes and mistakes in these same calls, as I'll show on
stuttering over his breath,
in case you don't believe me. Although even
someone's got to count how many times he says
extremely believe that it was simply the phone guy over-exaggerating, and it wasn't meant to be a serious detail. Let's play devil's advocate and say that it was meant to be taken seriously, and that the animatronics really did exist 20 years ago within the isolated story of FNAF 1. Was it retconned in the future games? Well, that's the thing, still no. We know due to FNAF 2 that they started to retrofit the originals that eventually become the FNAF 1 animatronics, with the new technology. But Phone Guy actually tells us that they were just so ugly, and specifically that they smelt, and so the company went another route leading to the toys, directly telling us that they still smelled from the original location, and they weren't even clean during this process, which is directly referencing this very quote that we're talking about now, about them still smelling. So with that in mind, as well as the fact that we don't actually know for certain when FNAF 1 takes place, nor when the animatronics
I wonder
were
what
first
they
created,
smell like.
there was
Just
no
do they
way
smell like
of
the
us
dead
actually
times
knowing
20?
in 2017 that this statement isn't true, therefore breaking Rule 2. All in all, the quote seemed to be Phone Guy exaggerating and simply joking, although even if you want to take it as a serious piece of information, it wasn't a noticeable change in the lore due to our limited information on their creation in 2017, meaning it breaks the second rule and cannot be the retcon. Even with the future games, we're learning that while the first Freddy's location was revealed to in fact open up in 1983, which again we didn't know in 2017, these characters existed a lot earlier than that either way. Speaking of the first location, and the next theory is William being charged and convicted was retconned. This comes from the fact that within the secret FNAF 1 newspapers, one has the title 5 children now reported missing, suspect convicted. Later reading, while the suspect was charged, the bodies themselves were never found, which goes against the fact that years after these first murders, William was still freely running around in both the FNAF 2 location and later the FNAF 1 location, which would be a pretty hard thing to be free to do after being found guilty with 5 counts of first-degree murder. Heading over to our checklist, and this does actually check all 3 boxes, but so did the last one at first glance, so are there any arguments that could be made against this one? No, not really. Wait, is this really the retcon? Well, not only is there a piece of evidence that directly tells us that
I was about to say, after all this time, I'm kind of wondering if where's the retcon at?
Yes, intentionally retconned from the story, that I'll get into properly in a second, but we do know from the following game, FNAF 2, that William was still roaming around freely in 1987, years after the murders, where he even does this whole thing again in the new and improved Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And then in the next game, FNAF 3, we see him still roaming around freely, entering the FNAF 1 location and breaking down the animatronics before inevitably being springtrapped. So there is actually evidence in the literal following games that he wasn't charged and convicted, but there's also a piece of evidence that I've been teasing since the start of the video. So let's just get into it. Within the Silver Eyes, we learn a lot about the murders and specifically the police's perspective on it all, through one of our main protagonists, Police Chief Clay Burke. Clay remembers how the whole police department knew that it was William, and that he was indeed arrested, although explains that there were no bodies, knew that it was William, and that he was
like, if bro is cheesing after being caught for the alleged murder of 5 people, he did that. He did that. It's crazy how he got away. Like, he is cheesing hard. Like, I don't remember that.
Indeed arrested, although explains that there were no bodies. They were never found.
So they couldn't get him.
Bodies, justice penalizes the guilty, but it must also protect the innocent, which seems to prove he was never charged/convicted in itself. But then within that same book, we also get direct proof with the quote, but there had been no evidence, there had been no bodies, and so there could be no charge. No charge.
Oh,
that's right. This explicitly tells us that the charge we read about in the FNAF 1 newspapers no longer exists in the story, which also means the conviction is waived away too. So even if you had any doubts that FNAF 2 and FNAF 3 directly showed us it was retconned, the Silver Eyes is the exact moment we can read for ourselves that the plot point was changed and removed from the story intentionally. There's even more proof in the future too, with FNAF Help Wanted containing a death screen that specifically hints at it, with a message nothing was ever proven in a court of law, meaning him being convicted is impossible. This being the retcon makes a lot of sense. Within the isolated story of FNAF 1, the murderer was indeed locked away, but as the story needed to expand and the murderer needed to return, Scott simply retconned that plot point out of the canon. As I mentioned, William was indeed arrested, although that doesn't mean he was charged nor convicted.
Cheesing super
as the process
hard.
goes from an arrest/being detained, which is sending him in for police questioning and things like that, later to a charge, which is accusing them of committing a crime with serious evidence, and then way further at the end of the process is when a conviction happens, which is when the person is officially declared guilty by a jury in court. So for this newspaper to still be true and not be retconned from the story, the police would have found serious evidence against William and he would have been found guilty in court. But thanks to the following games and the Silver Eyes though, we know that William was never charged specifically due to the lack of evidence, the bodies, and so the case against him was thrown out before it even reached the court and got anywhere close to a conviction.
I never even thought about William William's conviction like
Henry,
this.
And the retcon was simply shifting the convicted from William to Henry instead. Well, not only would that in itself break the first and second rules, as Henry didn't even exist in the games until FNAF 6, and so it couldn't have been noticed, but also because the Silver Eyes also directly answers that too, with the quote, "At first he had suspected Henry, just like so many others around town. But Clay had resisted, had delayed having him arrested, and sure enough they came to William Afton." Which explicitly tells us that while they did all suspect Henry at first, they never actually made
How'd you suspect the guy who builds the robots, though?
The biggest part of
like, how about suspect the dude who's been known to wear the costumes to entertain kids?
All of this to me is that there seems to be no clear alternative explanation for this. This coming from a factual newspaper means it's actually unable to be written off easily as a joke or exaggerating or anything similar. An alternate theory is putting Henry as the convicted don't work either, since we know that he wasn't even arrested from the books, but also because he didn't even exist as a character in the games until FNAF 6 released. This is why I spent the majority of this video trying to debunk and give alternative explanations for the other options, because I'm so certain that this is indeed the retcon. This option is the only one with no real argument against it, and is actually 100% confirmed to be the case in the books at the very minimum. I've seen it argued that Scott simply didn't understand the meaning of the word convicted, but I think that's quite a large assumption to make, especially considering that he could have easily used suspect charged for the title like he uses within the story itself.
And I'm sure, like, a grown man would, like, I don't know how old Scott was when he was, like, making these games, but just by the sound of the voice, I'm kind of saying, like, early 30s maybe. So, like, no offense, Scott, by the way, I'm sorry to give you unk age, but like yeah, I'm kind of just by the voice, like maybe early 30s, maybe mid 30s, not late, but mid, early. So yeah, how the hell would a 30-year-old man not know what the damn word conviction means? Like, or convicted, I mean.
Yet he didn't. He chose to use convicted, and also the fact that it actually works perfectly fine within the isolated lore from FNAF 1 itself. So in conclusion, with all of this information combined, William murders the 5 kids at Freddy's.
Doesn't know what the word conviction means. Come on!
Suits. At first, the police suspect Henry, who was so shaken by the event that he seemed guilty, and they almost move in for the arrest until they find video surveillance that identifies William as the man in the mascot. And so the next morning they arrest him on suspicion of murder, although they couldn't
smile,
find the
I can't get over
so
it.
There was no evidence that he even murdered anyone, meaning the case against him was thrown out before a charge could even be made, and he was a free man. It's even stated before a charge could even be made, and he was.
Like they let Book William go, and then they let this crazy thing go. Like in the game universe, like they let that go. Look how bushy those eyebrows are. He's evil. How could they not see it in their pixelated 8-bit court?
Was a free man. It's even stated in the Silver Eyes that after all of this, William literally leaves town, and there was nothing the police could do to stop him. All of this proving that Scott Cawthon's one confirmed retcon before FNAF 6 released, that was a noticeable change in the story, while not being a confusion point in the community and barely noticed, was in fact that the newspapers in FNAF 1 stated that the murderer was charged and convicted. But before we end off, are there any other retcons in FNAF? Well, luckily for us, Scott actually answered that very question in the post about the retcon. Quote, "While it's true that the story has developed new details over time that may not have been planned from the beginning, that doesn't mean that the pieces don't fit together as a whole. There is a lot of information crammed into these games, and there will always be details that I don't convey 100% as intended. I try to clear up those items, but I'm so..."
Okay, now I can see why people would think that if he kind of wrote like not 100% as intended. Yeah, maybe you could make the assumption that he didn't know what the word meant, but still, I don't know. I feel like it would have been something changed a long time ago.
Certainly not retconning things at will. I have more respect for the community than that. So while people joke that FNAF has been retconned about 100 times, or that Scott changes the lore every other day, I genuinely don't think there's been more than this one retcon in the story, where a plot point has been actively and intentionally changed and or reverted. People will immediately point to Burntrap, but in Security Breach itself, we see that while the whole ending is animated, which admittedly, yes, of course it makes you believe that it's the canon ending, it's actually just another 2-star ending, with the only 3-star ending in the game that does later get revealed to be the canon ending being Princess Quest. It's almost exactly like Sister Location, where we get a whole epic boss battle ending with Enid, the main villain, only to learn that it isn't even the canon ending. It wasn't retconned.
Fake ending.
It was just never the canon ending. It wasn't even the canon.
Did you actually have to brighten the screen up to see fake ending? I feel like I probably knew that at the time it came out, but I completely forgot. That's actually crazy.
An ending.
Like, why the hell didn't they do stuff like that in in Security Breach? Why not just tell us which one's the real ending?
Wasn't retconned. It was just never the canon ending to begin with.
Oh,
Although in Bertrand,
I guess when you make games marketed on mystery, you gotta keep some sort of shroud of mystery.
In this case, it just really seemed like it was. So all in all, I truly believe that we have the answer to FNAF's 1 retcon. And while I don't like using the word confirmed, I do have to admit that the Silver Eyes does explicitly state it to be removed from the story. And therefore, I do personally believe that this answer might actually be confirmed. But do you agree? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you all enjoyed.
I'm not smart enough to, well, I'm not gonna say smart enough. My memory for a lot of things in the series aren't really there, so I can't really ever question what a theorist says. But I can only just kind of take what they're putting together on the screen and be like, oh yeah, that's what that was, and yeah, that could be that. So I'll agree with Hyperjoy. Like, I'm not gonna act like I can go today and go find a huge stack of FNAF information to throw in a video. I don't know, I can't. But anyway, guys, I'll see you guys later. Peace out. That was a great theory from Hyperjoy.